Thanks for joining me, Mac Engel, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Engel Podcast. Before I introduce my very special guest for this latest episode, I want to talk a little bit about washed up and getting older and performers who are called washed up and that label. I went to the Metallica concert about a month ago at AT&T Stadium in Arlington. And when I went, I was expecting a crowd of about 50,000 people. Remember, Metallica has been around since about 1981. And I thought, man, those guys are probably washed up. Heavy metal band, yeah, they're probably about done. Well, when I went, I was stunned to see there were more than 100,000 people there for Metallica. And they were simulcasting that concert to movie theaters all over the world. Frontman James Hetfield is 60, and he still sounds like basically an angry gym teacher scolding you. Yeah! I loved it. It's a great show. And if they're washed up, then we need to redefine what washed up really means. You see, athletes, artists, performers, entertainers, comedians, actors, actresses, all of them are under the same umbrella of entertainment. And all of them eventually will be washed up. Or what usually happens, this is a gratuitous name drop, as Vince Gill told me, it's not that they're washed up, it's that the audience has moved on. They want the shinier new toy. Be that as it may, that hasn't happened to Metallica because, like I said, they had 100,000 people there for their show on a Friday night. 2 nights later, they gave a concert at the same facility with a different set, and they also got 100,000 people there. So they haven't been hit with that bug yet of an audience saying, yeah, I want something else. No, people still want Metallica. And one of the reasons why they still want Metallica is because they're not washed up. The athlete washes up way faster than anybody else. Now, don't look at Tom Brady. Tom Brady last season was washed up. He was 45 years old playing football against guys who were 23 years old. He was playing against the children of some of the guys whom he used to call teammates. That's how long Tom Brady was playing in the NFL. I still don't think we put enough value and weight on what Tom Brady did last season at 45. He should have been washed up. He was 45 years old. And the reason he kept playing was because even at 42, 43, 44, he wasn't washed up. And if you can still do it at a high level, then you're not washed up. If there's still an audience for you, then you're not washed up. My guest for this episode is not washed up, even though he's in his late 50s and he's doing something that he's been doing since he was a kid. This is a guest that I've wanted to get on for about a year because he did something last year that, to me, is one of the coolest things that I've ever seen anybody do. My guest for this episode is my older brother, David Engel, who last year rode a bicycle from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean in 41 days by himself. I don't know how he did it. I marvel that he did it. And the story and the particulars behind it are fascinating. And I'm excited to share that with you here in a second. But I want to further introduce David to you because he's somebody I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for. But how he did this is a little different. David is a financial advisor. How he became a financial advisor is a little unique. David was an academic, and as you soon learn when you hear him in this interview, his vocabulary would suggest he was an academic. But he didn't just go into academia to be, an econ major. David went into the classics, and he earned his PhD from Cal Berkeley a long time ago. And after he finished Cal Berkeley, and when there's one detail that I share about him sometimes. When he was at Berkeley, he was contacted through somebody at the school that the Vatican needed somebody there to translate something for him, something for them, rather. I'm like, wow, you translated something for the Vatican? And for years, and they paid him a few $100s, I don't know, not a lot. And for years, I marveled that David, my brother, translated something for the Vatican. That was really neat. Here I am writing stories about punters, and my brother's translating things for the Vatican. And I found out later what he translated for the Vatican was the instruction manual for Microsoft Windows. I guess it needed to be translated into Latin. So he finishes his PhD at Berkeley. I think he did his dissertation on Aristotle. And then he lands the coveted tenured track job. That's very hard to get, and he landed one of them at Penn State University. And I think it was in his third or fourth year at Penn State, 3 years away from reaching tenured status, which means you're essentially bulletproof. You're essentially a Supreme Court justice, knowing that you have job security forever and you can say or do whatever. And halfway through, he decides, yeah, I don't want to do this. I don't like doing this. He was living in State College, Pennsylvania. His wife, my sister-in-law, Francesca, was going through medical school at the University of Pittsburgh at the time. And he said, I don't want to do this. So he quit. And he moves to Pittsburgh, and he gets a job as a banker. Now, he's gone on and done quite well for himself, as you can imagine. He's now a financial advisor, and he's doing fine. And what I mean fine's not a four-letter word in this case. He's thriving. And one of the things that he has as a result of this job is a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedom, which has allowed him to do something that he was always wanted to do, and that is to go on this bike ride, which he is going to tell us right now. Please welcome my guest, my older brother, David Engel. Dave, where did you get the idea to do this, to ride a bicycle by yourself from the Atlantic to the Pacific?
This goes back a long time. I was 11 years old, delivering the Forest Hills Journal with our brother Christopher. We took turns every other week. It was a weekly rag, basically an advertising thing, but it carried some news. And one story that it played was a story about this ragtag band from Oregon who had decided to celebrate the bicentennial of the nation by riding from coast to coast. And they did that from Astoria, Oregon to Jamestown, Virginia. And they mapped out a course of mostly back roads so that they wouldn't be on interstates or anything. And they called it the Bike Centennial, which constituted cleverness in the 1970s. And I read it and I thought this was cooler than the Eagles or the Fonz or anything I had ever seen in my life. And a dream was born. So it never really died. When I got back into bicycling 10, 12 years ago, there it was, the germ of a dream still waiting for me. And almost immediately, I started to study about long distance unsupported bike riding and to talk incessantly with my family about it. And so really this thing got serious, and I would say about 2010 or 2011. So I've been riding very long distances and multi-day unsupported rides for more than a decade, all with the plan of one day being strong enough and having enough logistical and business support that I could be out of the office and not be missed too much for long enough to ride coast to coast. So I needed to be strong enough, and I needed to have a place in my life, my family, and my business where it was possible. And it finally all came together. But it started in 1976.
So when you say you needed to be, I take that back. You said an unsupported ride. Define that for me.
So there are lots of ways to bike tour, and the best way is probably where you travel with a group who set your destinations. They arrange for campsites or B&Bs or motels or hotels, and they carry your stuff.
Oh,
So
you
you
have like a
pack a
Sherpa with
bag,
you?
you ride from point A to point B, you stop at a certain point and they've got
Oh,
lunch waiting for you. If you get a flat tire, the sag wagon pulls up and changes the tire for you. It can be anywhere from pretty primitive to pretty darn posh, depending on how much money you want to spend. But that's considered supported touring.
oh.
And I did not do that. I carried everything that I needed for the 41 days of my ride on my bicycle. And if I didn't have it, I either did without or I would have to buy it along the way.
So you said 41 days. If I remember correctly, when this started, your plan wasn't 41 days. Wasn't your plan like 30 days or something much, it's like
The
shorter
initial
than that?
plan, that's right, was that I would take a route from Long Beach Island in New Jersey to Los Angeles. And the old joke in my business is if you want to make God laugh, make a plan. That was certainly true of this trip. Things went pretty much according to plan all the way to Illinois. No, Missouri. I got past St. Louis and I was on the old Route 66 on my way to Los Angeles. Every night at the end of the ride before bed, I would talk to my family, and I was talking to my wife, Francesca, and she said that she'd been telling her brother, who lives in California, about my intended route, and he had burst out laughing. And I said, why? And she said, because there's a heat dome over the Southwest and you'll die. You cannot ride across the Mojave right now. And at that point, I would have been scheduled to be in the Mojave in what, about 2 weeks, a little less. And one of the conditions of my parole, my being allowed to go out on these long distance rides with my wife's blessing, is that I don't take undue chances, and that if she feels unhappy about the risks I'm taking, I will alter my course. So on the fly, there in south central Missouri, I changed course and I turned north and west. And for the rest of the route, I pretty much followed what's called the Lewis and Clark Trail, which approximately follows where Lewis and Clark went to the Pacific Ocean.
So when you
That
started,
added 1,000 miles to the itinerary.
oh, it did?
800, 1,000,
I
something
didn't
like
know
that.
that.
Yeah.
So when you did this, and this was about a year ago, I don't think I'm a little hazy on this part. Did your wife, did Francesca get you in the car and then drive you from Philadelphia to Delaware or DC? Is that where you started?
Good. You're a little bit off. So the infant's dream of this ride had me starting at an ocean and ending at an ocean. But I live in Philadelphia, which is not at an ocean. So
Close.
the close. So the first day of the ride was Philadelphia to Long Beach Island.
You rode?
And yeah, so I bicycled from Philadelphia to the Atlantic Ocean.
Oh, I
And I
didn't.
met my
Okay.
family down there. And then we just threw the bike on the bike carrier of the car and drove home. And then I set off west from Philadelphia. Now, there's one more cheat code on this trip, which is when I got all the way to the West
Oh,
Coast.
wait. Time out. Don't
Oh, no.
go that yet.
Okay,
Wait.
but there's another cheat code on
Yeah, I
there.
know.
But yeah, I did all 4,100 miles of the ride. I bicycled from coast to coast.
So when you did it though, if I remember correctly, there were two paths. You kind of referenced it there a second ago. There are basically two routes to do this from the Atlantic, which is the northern route or the southern route. And the southern route, if I understand it correctly, you would have come through Oklahoma, Texas, and then cut across through northern New Mexico, northern Arizona, and into California. Is that right?
Uh, so there are a number of established ways that bicyclists go from coast to coast. The pure southern route is San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, and it's the shortest. It's straight across the south. There is a full northern route, which is quite long. And then there's the traditional bicentennial course, which is now called the Trans Am. And the Trans Am and the Lewis and Clark routes are fairly close. They've got a lot in common. So I was going to do sort of a mix. The course that
So
I picked was called the Route 66 course originally. That's the course I was going to do.
you did, make sure I get this right. You did Pennsylvania through Ohio,
Right?
Ohio.
Well, you skipped the West Virginia. I did the stovepipe of West Virginia
Okay, so you made it through West
into into Ohio.
into Ohio, Indiana,
Hmm.
Illinois,
Right?
Missouri.
Picked up St. Louis. Right?
Then you went south and then you worked your way north.
one day southwest, and then I turned around and went northwest in middle of Missouri and picked up one of the great biking trails in the United States. The old, let's see if I get this right. It was the um, Kansas, Texas, Missouri line called the Katy. And the Katy is converted rail bed, and it goes basically from St. Louis all the way to just a little bit south of Kansas City. And you can, in fact, pick up a spur where it ends and get all the way to the Kansas Cities on bike trail. So once I was in Missouri, I got to bike trail and I stayed on bike trail all the way to Kansas City. And across the country, whenever I could, I picked up additional bike trail miles.
You were doing about 100 miles a day, 110 miles a day.
So mathematically, it works out to 107 miles per day. Yeah.
How much were you eating?
I was eating horrifying amounts. It was absolutely shocking how much I consumed. One, you have to eat as you go, otherwise your muscles go into glycogen debt. And you would wish that the body would just turn to fat at that point and burn off some excess fat, but it's not what it does. When the body's under stress, the easiest source of energy is to just consume muscle. So you catabolize muscle once you've used up all of your readily available fuel. And you must, when you're doing an exercise like this, prevent that from happening. And the only way you can do that is by keeping a constant supply of glycogen in your bloodstream. So you drink gallons of Gatorade or Powerade. You eat energy foods like Cliff Blocks or Goo Packs, and you stop and probably eat the equivalent of 6 meals a day.
And if memory serves, I think you stopped Nebraska or Wyoming or something like that. And you were telling me about some Mexican restaurant that you stopped in. And I think you told me you ate 2 large burritos one night.
This was in, I believe it was Maryville, Missouri, just south of the Iowa border.
Okay.
And the restaurant was called El Maguey, which was memorable.
Wow,
And yeah, they had some gut buster special that I ordered that was the equivalent of like a pizza pie platter, just laden with every typical, fatty,
right.
lardy Mexican food, and it was so good, and a tanker of beer that you could dive into. And when the waiter brought it to me, I'm still dressed from the road, so I'm in cycling gear. I look like somebody who might be hungry, but he gave me this look that said, "Yeah, don't do it, buddy." And I cleaned my plate that night.
So this is the hard part of this conversation that I want to know about. So when you're eating all this and you're on a bicycle, what do you do about bathrooms?
Oh man, elimination is really important.
I can imagine. Well, you're sitting down, which is that
Yeah.
you've got the compression going for you. But I would imagine at some point, and you're a coffee drinker too. So
Mhm.
I would imagine at some point it was like everybody out of the way. I need to find something resembling a toilet. So what did you do about that?
So
I don't know I don't know what you can say on this.
this became a logistical consideration every morning. I would get up well before dawn. The night before, almost always, I would have found a convenience store or a gas station and bought a Starbucks double shot mocha. And the first thing I would do as soon as the alarm went off is I would stumble to the little mini fridge and slam that thing. And then I might eat a goo, or I might microwave a little sandwich that I bought the night before, anything to get my digestion moving. And then I would drink water. And then I would wait, and it would work. Every morning, I got to have what I called my constitutional before I got on the road, which was great because, yeah, if occasionally other things happened and you had to find a bush or a copse of trees, not a great experience for anybody, but fortunately didn't happen too often. Most of the time, my body cooperated.
So you had, I don't know if you can put this on, if you can share this or not, because I don't think I ever
I'm
saw.
really glad that you got to ask me about pooping for your podcast.
I didn't. I didn't. I just said bathroom. Totally different.
I think your audience knows. I think it's a
did.
sophisticated
That's why
audience. And
anybody asks
these
about
kinds
like
of things.
oh, I remember when I used to do marathon training when I ran marathons. The most terrifying part of it was clockwork. It was 1 mile in. I had to find a bathroom. It was awful. And it was one of the reasons I quit. I hated it.
my wife, the psychiatrist, tells me there's a whole cottage industry within psychotherapy of helping people train their bladders and their bowel movements against things that are called like the key in the door phenomenon. So, neurological systems all connected, and things that happen here affect things that go on down here, sometimes with catastrophic consequence, which let's share with the world, shall we?
I'm there's nothing, whatever you just said is not on my mind when I am duck walking around buildings praying I can find an empty toilet.
Right. But the
It's
thing is, the
terrifying.
brain doesn't stop here. It networks out, and it's down there talking to your sphincter. It's all one thing.
It's the worst.
It is.
So bad.
Since we're sharing here, that's pretty much why I don't run marathons anymore.
I don't blame you. It's
Too many disasters or near disasters, and maybe we should change the topic.
Okay. So
Yeah.
let's go back to your route. So you're in Missouri. You do go up through Iowa, correct?
I did. So I wound up. I was thinking I would be in Missouri for 3 days, and I think I was there a week because of the initial transfer, and then I went all the way west, and then all the way to the northwest corner to finish. So it was, I think, my longest bike ride in a single state ever, even though it doesn't seem like that big a state. But yeah, I got up to the northwest corner of Missouri, and then I cross into Iowa, and go up north and pick up the Wabash Trace Trail, which is again just a gem in Iowa. Beautiful, beautiful ride. Pounding rain and freezing cold for the first day of it, but a great ride.
So then you cut across Nebraska.
So I went up along the Iowa-Nebraska border, and the route would not have, but I'm a collector, so I needed to at least do a quick dog leg into Nebraska so that I could say that I had bicycled in Nebraska. I did the same thing biking into Kansas. I went just across the state line so that I could say that I biked in Kansas. Did the same thing when I got up to the South Dakota border. Took a little dog leg into what I think was, not sure I remember. So there's a we get the names wrong. So anyway, I did a quick detour in Nebraska, and then the rest of the ride was South Dakota along the South Dakota-Nebraska border, but in South Dakota the whole time.
Wyoming.
Went from South Dakota all the way across to Wall, which is the Badlands. Did a loop of the Badlands on the bicycle, which was
Did you go to Wall Drug?
spectacularly good. I did not go to Wall Drug this time because I think you only need to go to Stuckey's or Wall once. Wall Drug is a once and done, and I did it as a teenager.
Are you biked around the Badlands?
I biked the entire
Oh,
Badlands,
that's pretty cool.
and I had enough time left in my day that I figured, maybe I'll bike to Mount Rushmore. So I did. I finished that day in Mount Rushmore, which turns out is in hills called the Black Hills. So the end of that day was brutally hard. I was caught in thunderstorms and chased by free range cattle. You ever been chased by a cow before?
I have not. No.
Came in well after dark to Keystone, South Dakota.
Yeah.
And then the next morning rode up to the Deadwood Trail, the Deadwood Mickelson Trail, which gets you pretty far north. And the day after that, then Spearfish and into Wyoming.
So, and then Wyoming, and then Washington State or Oregon?
Wyoming, all the way across. Had my first Rocky Mountain crossing outside of Buffalo, Wyoming, up across the Powder River Pass, up into west. So Yellowstone was the second Rocky Mountain crossing, and from there into the little tail section of Montana. So West Yellowstone in Montana, and then up through the Bitterroot Valley and into Idaho. Again, this sort of stovepipe part of Idaho, down just around the little corner of Washington State and into Oregon.
So what was the highest elevation? I remember you and I would text. I would try to check in with you every night, and you were getting ready to go through Yellowstone. And for anybody who's never been there, it should be on your list. It's fantastic, but the elevation is legit.
Indoors.
How
So
high up did you go?
I think that my biggest climbs were like 10,000-foot days, and one of them would have been the Powder River Pass, which has an elevation of 9,666.
So if that was your highest elevation,
Hmm.
how fast do you think you were going when you were going down some of those elevations?
I learned my lesson in South Dakota. I was somewhere along the Missouri River, which at that point is just a sequence of large reservoirs. It's not really a river anymore. And um, I didn't have accommodation for the evening, and I needed to get to the next town before they gave away the few campsites that they had. So I'm at the peak of my elevation for the day, and I'm going to go down into this lake basin below. And I got the bike up to 52 miles an hour. And what I hadn't reckoned on was that I was on the other side of a hill system, which meant that the meteorology was different. There were winds, strong, gusting crosswinds. And one of them, when I was going 52 miles an hour, caught me and pushed me off the road, which was beautiful and well paved, across the rumble strip and onto the shoulder, which was just this minefield of scree waiting to pierce a tire. And it was terrifying. Thought I was going to die. Managed to get the bike under control without dying. Brought myself to a complete stop and stood there just shaking with terror for a good minute or two and told myself, speed kills, never again. So in my subsequent descents, like when I came to the western side of my Rocky Mountain crossings, I never went fast. I probably peaked out around 35 miles an hour. And I figured if I have to buy new brake pads, I have to buy new brake pads. So after my 52-mile-an-hour terror, and by the way, you know, Tour de France guys, they go 60 miles an hour and more, but they don't have the equivalent of sails on their bicycles. Those bags that I was carrying,
Yeah.
that just was a great way to pick up a crosswind. I, speed is dangerous, and I went slow after that.
You talked about, what was on your bike a little bit, and I don't think I ever saw a picture of it.
Okay, so I carried everything I needed, which was in all, it was about 30 pounds of gear, including the luggage. And just send this to you now. This is at the Continental Divide, which when I crossed it, I did not realize was the Continental Divide. So there's a compression bag on the front, and it's carrying a 1-pound tent, a 1-pound sleeping bag, the stakes and poles, and my flip-flops, and it's hanging under my aero bars up front. Under the center bar, the top bar of the bike, are the things that I need to grab during the day. My raincoat, some tools, my backup battery for my electronics, food. And then on the back, there's something that's basically the size of a doctor's bag sitting on an insanely expensive carbon fiber pannier rack. And in all, the gear weighs about 30 pounds, plus there are 2 water bottles, and that's it. So the contents are the pair of shorts that I'm wearing, the pair of shorts that I'll wear the next day while I wash and dry the ones that I wore the day before, total of 2 pairs of socks, 1 pair of long pants for going into restaurants, 1 pair of civilian underpants, 1 short sleeve shirt that looks okay, all rumpled, a sleeping pad, an iPad, repair stuff, a thermal layer, thermal leggings, and food, and an iPad to stay in contact with the office.
How bad did you smell at the end of those rides?
I always tried to sit away from other people when I went into restaurants.
Uh,
Especially on the rainy days, you could put Pigpen to shame. The filth would just emanate from you like a toxic miasma. I may have killed somebody accidentally. I'm not sure.
at any point in the ride, did you have, because it sounded to me like you had pretty good weather. Did you ever have to camp? I don't think you ever had to camp, did you?
I never had to camp. I thought I would
You got
in
motels
South
and
Dakota, but I
Airbnbs?
always found a motel. Or, the miracle of Airbnb. There were a couple of days when I couldn't find a hotel, but lo and behold, in these sleepy little towns, somebody would have an Airbnb. And my Airbnbs were reasonably priced, immaculately clean, convenient. Most of them had washers and dryers, which were a godsend. Just, and right there on your phone. I could book the reservation and all I had to do was slow down on my bicycling. I didn't actually have to get off.
So, did you have, because I know you've stayed in some places on some of your longer bike rides where you've stayed in motels that are not exactly Marriott. I don't think they had a point reward system. Did you stay any place where you thought, oh my God, I'd be better off sleeping in the middle of a highway than this place?
I'm not going to call this one out by name, but when I was in West Yellowstone, it turned out that the season was not over and all the hotels were booked. And I found one which was kind of off radar, an old, 1950s era L-cut motel. And it was run by this little old lady who smelled like cat urine. And I didn't sign the register. She said that that was not the government's business and it was cash only. And I woke up in 3 o'clock in the morning with a bug in my armpit. And I thought, okay, that's kind of where I draw the line. I'm out of
How
here.
much was
So
it? How much was the room?
it was probably $90.
They
Yeah,
charged the bug.
$90 for a bug in my armpit.
Did you charge the bug?
I did not charge the bug. I wondered whether there was some way I could, like just hit it up as a business expense, but I couldn't even do that.
And so on this 4,000 plus mile journey, did at any point did you think, what am I doing? This is stupid. I'm going home.
I don't think I ever did. I mean, there was the moment in Yankton, South Dakota, where I flirted with death, and that gave me grave reservations because I have obligations.
Yeah.
I have clients to take care of, and I have a family to take care of. I have a teenage daughter, and it would have been bad form for me to have died on her, pursuing this complete wild hare of a dream. After that, though, I was more cautious, and it never occurred to me, even in my greatest discomforts, to bail. In fact, all I worried about was that I would, for some reason or other, have to quit early. Our dad got sick at one point on the ride, and I thought, well, it's going to have to go home.
Really?
My wife's grandmother broke a hip at one point. She thought she would have to go see her, at which point I would have had to fly home. I kept expecting for the trip to end early. And the closer I got to my destination, the more superstitious I became.
Not bad.
There's a line from The Office. I'm not superstitious, but I'm stitious. By the end, I was super superstitious.
I like the best as you were recounting your answer to me, you said, I've got obligations and responsibilities. Number one, clients. Number two, family. That was honest.
That
I appreciate
that's your interpretation. I was progressing
it.
upward, not downward.
Okay.
You're uncharitable.
When you're on those rides, I know
Mhm.
you're a deep thinker.
You
Just
reporters, you're always twisting my
the
words
worst, I
around,
know,
man.
quoting people. But when you're on that kind of a ride where I would think it would be so much silence. Obviously, the sounds of the roads and cars and the wind against, corn or wheat or whatever else. But David, when you're on a ride like that, how deep into your own head are you?
Deep. At its A couple of things happen. One is that you're constantly attentive to the mere logistics of the here and now. You're forced, as the New Agers would say, to be very much in the moment because you have to attend to the mechanics of your tires and the road surface and where you're going to turn next. And you are attentive to weather in a way that civilians are not. Cloud lines, meteorology, winds, everything requires your constant attention. So some portion of your brain is there. Also, over the course of the day, you have a kind of psychodrama basically as your energy levels and your glycogen levels change. At around noon, you look at the clock and you go, I've been riding for 6 hours and I've only gone so far. Oh my God. And you get depressed. And then you get to the mile 100 and you realize you've still got 25 or 30 miles or 50 miles to go. And you get deeply depressed. And then when you're about 20 or really 27 miles from your destination, you get this second wind and things are really good. And in that last period, all consciousness has been beaten out of you by fatigue. And you achieve a Zen like tier of consciousness that I think is what Bill Murray must have been talking about when the Dalai Lama told him that he would attain complete consciousness upon his death. So you're on the brink of death and you have this, it's like a mystical experience. The world enlarges and you can be quite emotional. You can, like at the end of a marathon, you can get a little bit weepy sometimes,
Yeah.
soppy, sentimental. The natural world's beauty is more beautiful than ever in your life.
What was the prettiest spot? A spot that you came across in America that took your breath away?
So I'm torn between telling you the truth and giving it away and feeling that it would be selfish not to share. So I stayed the night in I think it was Lolo Springs, Montana, which is just east of the Idaho border. Got up over the Idaho border, and then I had basically an entire day of downhill riding. I could have coasted almost the entire way, 100 miles along the Clearwater Creek and River. And it's the most beautiful place. I mean, prettier than the Colorado Rockies, more beautiful than the Grand Teton. I've never seen anything so beautiful in my life.
Wow.
And I had an entire day of it. And the weather was perfect. And there was, because it's mostly First Nations land, no phone signal the entire day. My business partners had to handle any issues that arose that day. It was the one day I was out of touch with clients.
Uh, so then you do get to Portland. And I remember debating with you back and forth a little bit about the need that you could make it to the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lewis and Clark did it because I think that was my baseline in encouraging you. It's like, well, they did it. They didn't have a bike or a phone. So take me through the very end because I know you had a little bit of there's a little bit of wiggle room about this story and that journey to the actual.
There's all psychologically, I was a prisoner of my own imagination. I think that some people have this phenomenon worse than I do, but probably not many. I get a mental picture about how a scene is supposed to go, and I become captive to it.
It's got to be that.
Yeah, I mean, my standard example is my quitting scene when I left academia. I had this whole elaborate version of how I would walk into the department head's office and tell him I was quitting. And the actual scene was, yeah, I've decided not to put my tenure file forward. I'm leaving. I'll serve out the year, but I'm done. And that was it. And I walked out and said, well, that didn't go at all as planned.
It's like when Bull Durham
Imagine,
retired.
imagine telling yourself a story how something would go and letting it go on for 46 years of elaborations. That's what I had going into this ride. And as I got farther and farther west, I became obsessed with the question of how I was going to get from Portland to some piece of the Pacific Ocean because I was dead tired. All those rides, I'd been on the road too long. My legs felt like 4x4s. I was fatigued. I was sleeping sometimes 10 and 11 hours a night. And the thought of getting to the Pacific Ocean and then having to get back to an airport was overwhelming. I somehow couldn't get my mind around it. So I reached Portland, and at this point, the bike is like the Blues Brothers Bluesmobile at the end of the movie. Everything is just held together with chewing gum. The rear tire, which is the original rear tire, it's running on tubeless tires, which means it has sealant in it.
Yeah.
But it's got so many little mini punctures from where the sealant is spraying out that it's like polka dotted. So I called the tire Uncle Fester because it's so bald, and it's just going to go any second now. And I think, oh, please, I don't want to pull over and replace the tire at this point. Just get me to the ocean. So I get through Portland to the western suburbs of Hillsborough, and it's evening, and I'm in my gastropub, drinking my beer and eating my 2 dinners, and looking at the routes. And I've called ahead and I've talked to a local bike shop, the Portland Trek shop, and said, "Can I just ride out to NetArts? Do I have to go all the way to Astoria?" And they said, "No, that ride's fine. We do it all the time." So I knew that I could do the shorter ride,
Right.
but I didn't want to ride there and come back. So I looked for an Uber or a Lyft that would drive me from Tillamook, Oregon, back to Oregon, and you can't find them. There are no Ubers or Lyfts out there. So I broke my ideal.
A certain sort of rigid purist would say that I cheated. You know, I used a car for a portion of the ride, and there are these sorts of purists out there who talk about solo long distance bike riding, and it emotionally took something for me to push back against that sort of rigidity and say that this is my goal, this is my activity, my undertaking, and I can make whatever rules I want.
Mhm.
And I do still look back and think, why didn't I just bicycle out to the coast and come back? But when I look at my notes, my texts for those last few days, I know the answer. And it was that I'd given it all up. I was done. I had physically nothing left. I had emotionally very little left. I just needed to finish in a way that was satisfactory to me. So taking an Uber from Hillsborough, Oregon, out to NetArts, actually to Tillamook, then riding to the coast, dipping my wheel in the Pacific Ocean the way you're supposed to, and then riding the miles back home again, that was just fine. And the feeling of satisfaction that I had, not at dipping the wheel in the Pacific Ocean, but of hanging the bicycle on one of the hooks in the light rail system in Hillsborough, headed for the airport, was profound. And I can still remember that feeling of relief and, frankly, of awe that I had done a thing as a 57-year-old desk jockey that very few desk jockeys of any age ever get to attempt, much less complete. So I did have a sense that I'd done a thing when it was over.
For somebody who is contemplating this kind of bike ride, a long one, 4,000 plus miles, by yourself, what advice would you give them?
I have a lot to say on this topic, but the most important thing I think is to have realistic expectations about what can be done and what sort of physical preparation is required. There's a common adage in the community that says for a cross-country ride, you get into shape for the ride by doing the ride. And that may very well be true if you have young, spry ligaments like a 20 or a 25-year-old. But the older you get, the more unforgiving your tendons become. It's not just muscles, it's not just cardio, it's not just your lungs, it's your connective tissues. Tendonitis is the great killer on a long ride like this. So constantly fueling as you ride so that you don't catabolize muscle is important, but just building up a sufficient base to be able to do the kind of mileage, whatever mileage you choose, 25 miles a day, 75 miles a day, 150 miles a day, you've got to get to the point where you can do that base day in and day out. And that involves building up the connection between muscle and tendon in your legs. Otherwise, you will develop excruciating, crippling pain, which takes months and months to heal. So you've got to build up a certain base. You've got to build up a certain acquaintance with bicycle mechanics, just the basics of how to change a tire. When I started, it took me 30 minutes to change a tire. Now it takes about 5. And that's just because I've changed hundreds of bike tires by now. Everything's available on the web and YouTube now to teach you how to do it. To route you out, use the Adventure Cycling Association maps and follow them because they will keep you on safe roads. Supplement it with Strava or Map My Ride or a Komoot, one of the online apps. Follow those routes, stay off of busy roads, and listen to your body, listen to the weather. I think that one of the big lessons in my evolution here is to learn that nobody gives you a medal for suffering through a day of misery, rain, storm, and pain. And this
You
is
know how
supposed to be
disappointing that is for you and I.
It took me a long time. to
I know.
learn, and I tried.
Wait a
to get
minute,
lot of
there's no
medals
reward
along
for
the
that?
way.
Sorry.
When I stopped on my rainy, cold, or windy days, the windy day leaving Cody, Wyoming, and going out to the foot of the Wapiti was, I went 7 miles an hour for 2.5 hours. It was like I was riding straight uphill, and all I was doing was riding into 30-mile-an-hour winds. And when I quit for the day, I felt disappointed in myself. And when I took a day off the next in hopes that the winds would fall, I scolded myself throughout the day. But I had a better ride overall and less physically taxing than if I hadn't had this sense. So be realistic about who you are, stay within your limits at all times, forgive yourself every now and then, and have a support system in place. And that support system in place means you got to be able to leave your work and your family for a while and have them be okay. Because who could be away from their desk for 41 days in a row?
Yeah.
If COVID hadn't come before and forced us into lockdown and given us all these powers of remote work, I would never have been able to do this trip. If I didn't have a partner back in the office and 2 amazing assistants back in the office, I could never have done it. This is not something that everybody can do. The physical part is the least of it. The time and, frankly, the money are the limiting factors, I think, for most people.
How much was this? You told me, what was this, like 5?
I'm embarrassed to say. So all in about $9,000.
That's not that much.
For 41 days on the road, right?
Yeah.
It comes out to what? A little more than $200 a day. And that's hotels every night.
Yep.
Meals on the road every night, and just regular, bike maintenance and everything else. It's not like I was staying at the Ritz every night. But even a cheap hotel is $100, $125 a night, and some of them are more. And it's night after night after night. And again, you're eating for 2. So
now that you've done it and you had this vision of doing this since you were a kid, when we were living in Cincinnati, is that right?
1976.
So 1976, you have this idea, you're going to do it, you're going to do it, you're going to do it. And I'll be damned, one day you finally do it. You map out the time, you've got the money, all the things that you just said. And then it's such a neat story. Then you actually do it and you're done. Did it meet your expectations?
When I talk about this, I always bring up Melville's Captain Ahab, because he had this lifelong obsession, right? He had his white whale.
Yeah.
And his worst day in life was not any of those days of toil and trouble out on the high seas with all its discomforts. The worst thing that ever happened to Ahab was that he fulfilled his obsession. He got to find his whale. And I worried the whole time, because he got killed, right? I worried the whole time that would be the effect here, that I would do this thing and look back and either have is that all there is? Or just a profound sense of disappointment. I didn't think that there was any possibility the reality would meet the dreams, because again, the dreams were decades long in the building. To my delight, I have found that they exceeded my expectations, and
Really?
that there were pieces of reward and pleasure and satisfaction that built over time. I'm happier now with the ride a year later, looking back, even than I was at the time. Although I will tell you, for about a month after I got home from the ride,
Yeah.
every night I had anxiety dreams about it. I was on the bicycle in my dreams for a month, about to crash in a storm, on busy roads, with some sort of an odd mechanical problem. Every night it was a different anxiety dream about being on the bicycle. And it only went away when I went back, looked through all of my records, my map logs, my texts to you and other people, emails, my photographs, and I assembled it into this massive, unpublishable memoir. Once I wrote it up, it all went away. And I find a year later that the memories would have faded, but I can go back and read and see the pictures, and it fills me with warm fuzzies. So what now? The shelf, I got to go look for new things to do. So I want to publish a novel. I've written a manuscript. I've written 2 manuscripts. I got to find an agent. I'm thinking maybe I'll try to run a marathon again. And I'll do some other long rides, but never 40 days, maybe 2 weeks.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Catch you later.
Good to see you. Bye.
See you, Dave.